Hey there! Today we're going to be looking at Thomas Harriot's Brief and True Report of the Newfoundland of Virginia. I included a PowerPoint that you could look at. It gives a little bit of history into what was going on at the time. And actually, I have a copy of this book because I'm a nerd. I got this from the Outer Banks when I went there last summer. So, the reason I keep this in here, even though it's not in your book, is because it's a really great piece of local North Carolina history. Even though it says it's a brief and true report of the Newfoundland of Virginia, it actually probably is documenting more northern North Carolina, like the Outer Banks. So, we'll start there. So, one of the coolest things about these guys is we have our guy Thomas Harriot. He's the writer, okay? So then he had this illustrator, John White, and actually John White drew a lot of these pictures. He drew a lot that are on your PowerPoint as well. Anyway, so John White actually was the grandfather of Virginia Dare. And if any of you North Carolinians know, Virginia Dare was the first English child born in the New World. So, and she was also a member of the Lost Colony. So, this is just a great piece of North Carolina history as well as American history. So, that's why I keep it in here if you're wondering. Okay, so your question was to look at the purposes for the Harriot piece and the Smith piece. So, I don't know if you could tell a difference, but I think there is enough there that you can kind of see. So we have Thomas Harriot, who basically says, hey, it is your duty to come over here and colonize the New World. You probably saw that. However, he doesn't say the word colonize. He actually says, it's our duty as Christians to come help them. Okay, and that's always problematic in post-colonial literature in that people say that it was their job to come help the Native Americans because they couldn't help themselves. Okay, so there are a few little places that I want to look at, and I'm sorry, I have my book with me too, but on page 50, one of the things he questions is their God. While they have gods, he says, well, it's not the one true God. So on page 50, he says, some religion they have already, which although it's far from the truth, yet being as it is, there is hope that it might be easier and sooner reformed. So basically, what he's saying there is that, okay, they already have religion, but it's not the true religion. But because they already have religion, they're probably more apt to take on our religion. So there are a few little problems with that. Basically, he says they're more pliable. Also, he says that the natives are really willing to give up their own religion. Mostly after Harriot and his guys left, what happens? Villages just die, right? Villages die. Now, he doesn't understand it. The natives don't understand it. So probably what happened there was these English guys brought in diseases. Probably smallpox. I know they talk about the invisible bullets and there's like talk of coagulated blood, so we do think it's probably some kind of skin disease. So smallpox. And so they would go and then these villages would die when they left. And they thought, oh my gosh, if we please these guys, then maybe they won't send a god to kill us. Now, again, we have to take into consideration a few things. Number one, the language barrier. Thomas Harriot isn't 100% sure what these guys are saying anyway, so he makes a lot of assumptions here. He says that they fear us, they love us. He says that they are really willing to give up their God, when I'm not 100% sure that they were. However, one thing he never does do is say that he's responsible for their death. Now, another thing that he does, and this just drives me crazy, he says about the Bible, he says that the natives take the Bible, and he says actually on page 52 that they touch it, embrace it, kiss it, hold it to their breasts. And it's a tone of superiority that kind of gets me here. He never says anything really, really bad about them, but he kind of always says, oh, these poor, poor people, they don't even know what to do with the Bible, so they have to rub it on themselves and kiss the Bible. And so he's like, they don't even know how to use it. Now, that's a little interesting because Native American, especially at that point, Native American literature wasn't terribly written down. It was more of an oral tradition. So any religion would have also kind of come from the oral tradition. So they wouldn't have had necessarily a Bible. So one thing that's great is they say, well, we're British, we document everything. So of course they documented the Bible. And since these Native Americans didn't document anything, well, it's not true. And so problems here. Also, But when you're reading this, and my students say it all the time, you look at Thomas Harriot and you're like, he wasn't a bad dude. Like, he doesn't call the Native Americans savages, like John Smith later does, like so many other writers did. He doesn't call them savages. He doesn't necessarily come in and try to kill them like John Smith did. He just says, we need to change them. And so that's problematic. They need to change them. So, there are a few things that are kind of interesting there. And so, that's when we kind of have to start saying, do we believe what he's saying? Okay, I read this and I'm like, well, okay, I feel like a few things are debatable, dubious, if you will. I think that the Native Americans didn't necessarily think these guys were gods. But it's great if you're trying to get people to come over to say, hey, if you come to this place, they'll think you're a god. So, I doubt that. I doubt that the people were that willing to give up their religion. Other than that, I'm okay with it. I'm okay with him. Here's the biggest thing that I have to question this. Thomas Harriot, he wrote this piece, and remember, it's probably a piece of religious propaganda, with the purpose being, the thesis statement is, it is your job, English people, as good Christians to come over and civilize, convert the Native Americans. Problem with this is that if you do any research, if you ever look up Thomas Harriot, you don't see much besides for the brief and true report of the New Found Land of Virginia. Except for, you'll find a few things on astronomy, which is interesting. He was actually a scientist. That's not terribly surprising since he was here as a documenter of what was going on. One of the biggest things is that, at least later in his life, Thomas Harriot was an atheist. And so I feel like that makes this whole piece much more disingenuous, that he wasn't really here writing from his belief in Christianity. Rather, he was writing because Sir Walter Raleigh paid him. And so he paid him to say, hey, it's your job. And so basically, it kind of turns it into a piece of religious propaganda. It's your job. Come over here and save the Native Americans. Kind of makes you think about this a little bit differently. So, if you want to, go back and read it again. Okay, now we're going to talk about Smith. So now we got to talk about John Smith. Probably when you were reading it, you saw that it wasn't terribly interesting. It's actually a lot more dense. There's a lot of shift changes. We'll talk about all that. But the one thing that's great about John Smith, and probably why you know of him, is Disney's Pocahontas, right? We all heard of Pocahontas. I know that's what I thought of the first time I read John Smith. I was like, oh, he's that blonde dude. Okay, so we definitely need to talk about the history of John Smith and Pocahontas. Number one, Pocahontas was 12. He was close to 40. Okay? So there's that. They never had an affair, and actually Pocahontas did date somebody else and married them, and we'll talk about that in a second. Anyway, so John Smith. And this guy is so interesting, and you probably read a little bit of the history about how he was sold into slavery at some point, how he escaped, how he killed 2 Turkish men, and how he ended up on the boat that took him over to America. And so, some interesting things that happened. John Smith was a hard man. He was not very popular on the boat. He really thought that people should work for themselves. And since this boat was full of people who could afford to come to the New World, aka rich white people, they weren't used to working, and so he had a problem with a lot of these people. And he was a worker. That was one thing he really did do. But he got into a lot of trouble on the boat. In fact, everybody hated him. They all just kind of wanted to kill him. And actually they said, when this boat lands in the New World, we are going to kill John Smith. But get this, that's so funny to me. Anyway, so what happened was before they left the docks, there was this secret envelope that said, okay, the leader of the boat is going to be John Smith. Okay, leader's going to be John Smith. So nobody opened the envelope because they weren't allowed to until they got to the New World. I mean, I don't know about you. I would have opened the envelope. I mean, who was going to even be able to tell? It's not like they had cameras or anything back then. But so, they were about to kill him when he got a reprieve right at the last minute because he was now their leader. Probably he was pretty lucky though, or the people were pretty lucky that he was their leader because like I said, he was kind of a hard man who believed in self-reliance. And so the people had to work, and because they had to work, they lived through the first couple bad years in Jamestown. Now, if you're wondering where Jamestown is, that is in the state of Virginia. If you've ever been to Colonial Williamsburg, it's around there. It's probably like 15, 20 minutes from there. So it's really, really close. And Colonial Williamsburg is actually modeled after Jamestown. So just a piece of information. So anyway, so John Smith continued to be really unpopular. Even while he helped the people, he still was a bully. That's a word people have used to describe him. He's a bully. And one day he was asleep on a boat, and a bag of gunpowder mysteriously blew up in his lap. Nobody ever knew what happened from it, but most people think that it was one of the other settlers that tried to kill him. However, I guess when you get a bag of gunpowder exploded in your lap, it's really embarrassing. So he ended up going back to England, and he ended up going back to England with kind of a bad reputation as the shame kind of washed up old dude. And if you've read this, this piece that he wrote happened 10 years after the fact. So when you're reading it, it actually happened 10 years before. So one of the things that was also happening is that in England, Pocahontas had come over to England, and she had come over to England because she had been kidnapped by John Rolfe. She had been converted, and then she had married her captor, John Rolfe, and ended up going back to England with him. And it was really interesting because they kind of put her on display there. They put her on display. She actually was a great ad for the tobacco company because she smoked, and people in England really didn't smoke that much until right around Pocahontas. So it's really interesting. So anyway, so then she ended up going to England, and I think she probably got smallpox. Most historians say they don't know how she died, but that's probably the biggest belief, is that's how she died. Okay, so obviously we have to question this guy. There are some fun things in here. Probably you read them. My favorite is when he's on a boat with his guide. It's him, his guide, maybe one other dude, him and his guide. And he's attacked by like 1 million Native Americans, and they're throwing arrows at him. And so he takes that guy and he uses him as a shield, and somehow there's 1 million people shooting arrows at him. And it never really says what happens to the guide, right? But he only gets like a flesh wound, and actually it says most of his clothes caught it. So there's 1 million people like shooting arrows at you, and you get a flesh wound. I mean, I think it's debatable. So there's that, and I mean, there's a ton of examples in here. So with that, I want to talk about his purpose pretty quick. So his purpose in this piece is more of an adventure story. We talked about his bad reputation, and we talked about how his whole life he was an adventurer, so why wouldn't he write this adventure story? He wanted to get back into the good graces with the people in England. He wanted to actually be the captain of the Mayflower, but he was not. It was Miles Standish who was elected to do that. So his purpose really here is an adventure story. But you can't just write an adventure story because you still got to do one thing: sell America. Sell it for settlers to come over. We have to think about who the audience is. But still, you have to think about, okay, I hear that there's this great adventure to be had. Every time I'm going to win, every time I win, there's a great adventure to be had. So come over here. And so it sounds like America is this really great, wild, and prosperous place where you have no Native Americans to fear. And so there's really nothing to fear, even though we know that's not true. We know that there were Native Americans who had really bad relationships with the settlers, and we know that it was cold. It was cold where they were. People froze. People starved. And so he doesn't really tell us anything about all that. So you have to really think that he's still trying to sell America. Okay, a few other things I want to talk about, the narration. So if you read it, it's kind of interesting. There's a part where he talks in first person, I, me, my, and then there's a part where he talks in third person, basically describing John Smith. So that's basically like saying Bethany Hunter is wearing a green dress. Okay, so what was the reason for that? Think about it. So if I say, well, I don't like that girl, well then you would probably say, I wonder what's going on in her head. But if you said, that girl is a jerk, probably it's more believable. So from the narration, instead of saying, I mean my, third person narration is more from God almost. So it's more believable. So that's why he wrote about himself in the third person. I mean, we know what we say about people who write about themselves or talk about themselves in the third person. They've always got something psychological, but usually it is kind of a narcissism complex. So it gave him more credibility. believe it or not, to this crazy story. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the ceremony. So this is the part where Pocahontas comes in. Okay, so we've been led to believe, probably in most of history, that what was going to happen was Powhatan, Pocahontas' father, was going to take John Smith and cut off his head. Probably not. Most historical literature says that probably wasn't what was going to happen. Rather, what was going to happen was Powhatan was accepting John Smith into the tribe. Okay? So, remember when he said, well, they won't eat with me. They're going to eat me. No, they fed him well because they respected him. They didn't eat with him because they were not members of the same tribe. Later, when that ceremony had taken place, they would have eaten with him. We just never got to that. So there's that. And so the cutting off of the head, that situation really was more of a ceremonial death. So a death from one culture to another. They were taking John Smith in. Okay? So then the big question is, and this is probably the biggest question in history, is what was Pocahontas doing? Some people say, well, she's just a little girl, and she was just a little girl. 12 years old, probably, somewhere around in there. She was a little girl, and so she just said, I'm going to play. I'm going to be playful, and I'm going to jump in the middle of the ceremony. That's one idea. Or some people think that she was really trying to save him. She did have a really good relationship with the settlers, so, I mean, you could say, I doubt it. I really do. And so she probably was just this goofy little girl, but her legacy is so different and so renowned. She's somebody who brought peace to the Native Americans and the settlers in the New World. So it's kind of interesting. Okay, well, that's all for today. If you have any questions, always let me know. Email me or call me or come visit. I'm here from 11 to 5:30 on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Y'all have a great week, and I'm going to put another one up next week. Thank you.